Sometimes the person everyone fears is the one who needs love the most. Sometimes the strongest among us are drawn to heal what the world has broken. In the village of Vargheim, no man would go near the widow Astrid. They called her cursed, a bringer of death. Her husband had died under strange signs, and now she lived alone, while people whispered and pointed. Then came Ulrik, a giant Viking warrior who shocked everyone by asking for her hand in marriage. The villagers thought he had lost his mind. They said the widow's curse would claim him too. But Ulrik had learned something during his travels. A dying, wise woman had told him about ancient magic and family curses. She spoke of a woman who could break the chains that bound his bloodline. Ulrik saw past the fear and rumors. He saw a woman carrying secrets that could save them all. But what he discovered about Astrid would change everything he thought he knew about love, power, and destiny. What was Astrid really hiding that made an entire village tremble in fear? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Vargheim like the breath of sleeping gods, curling around the wooden longhouses and stone foundations that had weathered 3 generations of harsh Nordic winters. In this village nestled between fjord and forest, where the scent of pine mixed with salt air and wood smoke, life moved to rhythms as old as the carved dragon heads that watched from every rooftop. Astrid Blackvein had once been the pride of this place. 7 years ago, when she first arrived as the bride of Jarl Magnus Ironwill, the women had envied her beauty, and the men had respected her noble bearing. She possessed the kind of striking features that made bards compose verses, raven black hair that fell like a waterfall past her shoulders, eyes the color of winter lakes, and a grace that spoke of ancient bloodlines. The bloodstone pendant that hung at her throat had been her grandmother's, and her grandmother's before that, passed down through a line of women who understood things others preferred to forget. The deep red stone seemed to pulse with its own inner fire, catching light even in shadow, but most villagers now avoided looking at it directly. They said it held too much knowledge, too much power for any mortal woman to carry. But that was before Magnus died. Now, as Astrid moved through her daily tasks in the longhouse she had once shared with joy, the bloodstone felt heavy against her chest, not with weight, but with memory. The house itself seemed to echo with ghosts of laughter that would never return. Magnus had been a good man, a fair jarl who listened to his people and protected what was precious. Their marriage had begun with genuine affection and grown into something deeper, something that made the long winter nights feel warm and full of promise. Until the dreams started. Magnus had begun waking in cold sweats, speaking of shadows that moved wrong and whispers that came from beneath the ground. He grew thin and haunted, his once bright eyes becoming distant and fearful. The village healer could find nothing wrong, but Astrid knew better. She had seen the signs before, in stories her grandmother had whispered by firelight, stories of ancient things that slept beneath the earth and the prices paid to keep them sleeping. She had tried to help him, tried to use the knowledge that flowed in her blood like a hidden river, but her efforts only seemed to make things worse. Magnus grew more agitated, more terrified, until one terrible night he simply never woke up. They found him in their bed, his face peaceful but his wedding ring blackened as if touched by fire, and on his brow sat his simple iron crown, twisted and charred beyond recognition. The village elders whispered of curses. The common folk spoke of witchcraft. And Astrid found herself transformed from beloved Jarl's wife to feared widow, carrying the blame for a tragedy she had desperately tried to prevent. Runa, her faithful servant, was perhaps the only soul in Vargheim who still looked at her without fear. A woman of 50 winters with silver-streaked hair and hands, weathered by decades of honest work, Runa had served Astrid's family since before Astrid was born. She alone knew the truth of what Astrid carried, the burden that had been passed down through the female line for countless generations. They fear what they don't understand, Runa would say, when she found Astrid staring out the window at villagers who crossed themselves and hurried past. But fear makes people cruel, my lady, and cruel people make dangerous choices. The dangerous choice came in the form of whispers about driving her out, about burning her longhouse, about ending the curse they believed she carried. Astrid bore it all with the quiet dignity her grandmother had taught her, but inside, the loneliness was a weight that grew heavier with each passing season. Then Ulrik Skaldhammer returned from his raids. Astrid first saw him from her window as he strode down the main path through Vargheim, and even at a distance she could understand why his mere presence changed the entire village atmosphere. He stood nearly a head taller than most men, with shoulders broad enough to bear mountains and hands that had clearly known both sword and shield for many years. His auburn hair fell to his shoulders, braided with tokens from his travels, and his beard was trimmed in the style of warriors who had earned their reputation through deed rather than boast. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, pale blue, like ice over deep water, and carrying a weight of experience that spoke of more than just battle. When he looked at people, really looked at them, it was with the attention of someone who had learned to see past surface appearances, to the truth beneath. The village welcomed him as they always did, returning warriors, with feast and celebration that lasted 3 days. Astrid watched from her window as torchlight danced on laughing faces, as ale flowed and stories were shared of distant lands and fierce battles. She had not been invited, of course. Her presence would have cast a shadow over the joy, or so they believed. What she did not expect was to find Ulrik standing at her door on the 4th morning, his massive frame filling the doorway as he waited with the patience of mountains. "Astrid Blackvein," he said, his voice carrying the rumble of distant thunder. "I would speak with you." Runa had answered the door, her face a mask of protective suspicion, but Astrid stepped forward before her servant could turn him away. Up close, Ulrik was even more imposing, but his eyes held no threat, no judgment, only a curious intensity that made her feel seen for the first time in years. "What would a great warrior want with a cursed widow?" she asked, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Perhaps," he said, "to discover if the curse lies with the widow or with those who choose to see curses where none exist." The words hung in the morning air like morning mist, strange and unexpected. Astrid found herself studying his face, searching for mockery or hidden agenda, but finding only earnest attention. "You speak in riddles, Ulrik Skaldhammer. Then perhaps we should speak more plainly." He stepped back slightly, a gesture of respect that surprised her. "I have traveled far and learned much. In distant lands, I encountered a seer, a woman of great age and greater wisdom, who spoke of things that haunt bloodlines and the rare souls who can break such bindings." Astrid's hand moved unconsciously to the bloodstone at her throat. "And what did this seer tell you? That I would find my answers in a woman who guards the old runes, who carries knowledge in her blood, and who has been called cursed by those too blind to see her true nature." His pale eyes met hers directly. "I believe I have found her." The words sent a chill through Astrid that had nothing to do with the morning cold. She glanced at Runa, whose weathered face had gone pale with understanding, then back at this giant of a man who spoke of things that should have been secret. "You speak of dangerous knowledge, warrior." "I speak of necessary knowledge." Ulrik's voice grew quieter, more urgent. "My bloodline carries its own burden, its own curse that has claimed the men of my family for 7 generations. I have seen what it does, how it twists and destroys everything we try to protect. The seer told me it could be broken, but only by one who understands the old ways. And if she was wrong, then I will face whatever comes, as my fathers did before me." He paused, then added with surprising gentleness, "But I do not think she was wrong. I think she led me to exactly who I need to find." Astrid felt the world shifting around her like sand beneath waves. Here was a man who spoke of curses not with fear, but with determination, who looked at her not as something to be avoided, but as someone who might hold answers. After years of isolation and whispered accusations, the possibility of understanding of partnership was almost too much to hope for. "Why would you risk the village's condemnation?" she asked. "They will say you have gone mad, that my curse has claimed another victim. Let them say what they will." Ulrik's smile was slight, but genuine. "I have faced worse things than village gossip, and perhaps it is time Vargheim learned to see past its own fears." Runa stepped forward then, her protective instincts overriding her usual deference. "My lady, this is not a decision to make lightly. If he speaks truth about his bloodline, then we both carry burdens that have shaped our lives." Astrid finished quietly. She looked at Ulrik again, noting how he held himself ready for rejection but hoping for acceptance. "What exactly are you proposing, Ulrik Skaldhammer?" "Marriage," he said simply, "a union that might break both our curses, or at least give us the strength to face them together." The word fell between them like a stone into still water, sending ripples through everything Astrid thought she knew about her future. Marriage to a man she barely knew, who proposed not from love, but from necessity, who offered partnership in the most dangerous kind of work imaginable. And yet, as she looked into his pale blue eyes, she saw something she had not expected to find: hope, not just for himself, but for her as well. Hope that the knowledge she carried might finally serve a purpose beyond simply enduring. Hope that the isolation she had accepted as her fate might not be permanent after all. "You ask for much," she said finally. "I offer much in return," he replied. "My protection, my strength, and whatever help I can. Provide in understanding what we face." Astrid glanced once more at Runa, whose expression had moved from suspicion to thoughtful consideration. Then she looked back at this giant warrior, who had travelled vast distances to find her, guided by a seer's words and his own desperate hope. "I will consider your proposal," she said. "But know this, the path you speak of walking is more dangerous than any battle you have fought. The things that bound our bloodlines are older than kingdoms and hungrier than wolves. If you truly mean to face them, you will need more than sword and shield." "Then it is fortunate," Ulrik said, "that I have found someone who understands what those things might be." As he walked away from her door, Astrid remained watching until his tall form disappeared into the village proper. The bloodstone at her throat seemed warmer than it had in years, and for the first time since Magnus died, she allowed herself to wonder if redemption might be possible after all. 3 days passed before Ulrik returned, and when he did, he came not to her door, but to the village centre, where the great oak stood, the tree beneath which all important matters of Vargheim were decided. Word spread quickly through the settlement, carried on whispered voices and worried glances, until it seemed every soul in the village had found reason to gather near the ancient tree. Astrid felt the summons in her bones before Runa brought word. Something in the air itself had changed, crackling with the tension that comes before great storms. She dressed carefully in her finest gown, deep blue wool embroidered with silver threads, and arranged her hair in the intricate braids that marked her noble heritage. If Ulrik meant to make his proposal public, she would meet it with dignity, befitting her bloodline. The bloodstone pendant lay heavy against her chest as she walked through the village streets, aware of every eye upon her. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts. Men touched iron for luck as she passed, and even the dogs seemed to sense the weight of the moment. The whispered conversations that followed in her wake carried words like madness and doom, and cursed twice over. When she reached the great oak, Ulrik was already there, standing with the patient stillness of mountains. He had chosen his own finest garments, a tunic of deep green wool with silver clasps, leather breeches that spoke of wealth and status, and his father's ceremonial sword at his hip. But it was what he held in his hands that made Astrid's breath catch in her throat. Magnus's death crown sat nestled in a cloth of white wool, the simple iron circlet that had been twisted and blackened on the night her husband died. She had not seen it since the funeral rites, when the village elders had taken it away, claiming it was too dangerous to keep. The metal gleamed dully in the afternoon light, still bearing the strange marks that no smith could explain, patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. "People of Vargheim?" Ulrik's voice carried easily across the gathered crowd, deep and clear as a war horn. "I stand before you today to speak truth about honor, about courage, and about the fear that has poisoned this village like smoke from a poor fire." Elder Bjorn stepped forward, his weathered face stern with disapproval. At 70 winters, he was the oldest man in Vargheim, and his word carried the weight of tradition. "Ulrik Skaldhammer, you are a warrior of great renown, but this matter does not concern. This matter concerns every soul who calls Vargheim home." Ulrik interrupted, his tone respectful but firm. "For 7 years, you have whispered of curses and blamed a woman for tragedies she did not cause. You have let fear make cowards of brave people and turned your backs on one who has never harmed any of you." A murmur rippled through the crowd, part agreement and part unease. Astrid saw faces she had known. Since girlhood, people who had once smiled at her, who had celebrated her marriage and mourned appropriately at her widowhood, now looking away as if her gaze might bring misfortune. "She killed the Jarl," called out Ingvar the blacksmith, his voice rough with accusation. "Magnus was healthy as an ox until he married her. Then came the nightmares, the sickness, and finally death itself knocking at his door. Magnus died fighting something you cannot see." Ulrik replied, lifting the death crown for all to observe. "Look at this circlet, truly look at it. What forge fire could work such changes in iron? What natural force could twist metal as if it were river clay?" Even from her position at the crowd's edge, Astrid could see how people recoiled from the sight of the crown. The blackened patterns seemed to move in the afternoon light, forming shapes that hurt to contemplate directly. She remembered that terrible night when she had found Magnus cold and still, the crown burning, her fingers when she tried to remove it, as if the metal itself had become cursed. "Dark magic," whispered Helga the Weaver, making the sign against evil. "Witchcraft, brought into our village by the widow." "No." Ulrik's voice cut through the rising fear like a blade through cloth. "Protection magic. Magnus died defending his people against something that would have consumed this entire village had he not made the ultimate sacrifice." The words hit Astrid like a physical blow. She stared at Ulrik, this giant warrior who spoke as if he knew secrets about her husband's death that she herself did not fully understand. The bloodstone at her throat grew warm, almost burning, as if responding to truths being spoken aloud for the first time. Elder Bjorn shook his greyed head. "You speak of things beyond your understanding, young warrior. The death crown bears witness to corruption. The death crown bears witness to a man who faced darkness to protect those he loved," Ulrik declared. He turned then, his pale blue eyes finding Astrid across the crowd. "And his widow carries the knowledge needed to complete what he started." The gathering fell silent, save for the whisper of wind through oak leaves. Astrid felt every gaze upon her, felt the weight of judgment and fear pressing down like a heavy cloak. This was the moment that would define everything that came after, not just for her, but for the village itself. She stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance of their whispers. "You speak boldly of things you claim to know, Ulrik Skaldhammer. But what proof do you offer beyond words?" From beneath his tunic, Ulrik drew forth something that made several people gasp and step backward. It was a set of bone dice, yellowed with age and carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change as they caught the light. Astrid recognized them immediately, not the specific dice, but their nature. She had seen their like in her grandmother's hidden collection of artifacts from the old times. "These belong to the seer who spoke to me of bloodline curses and the women who guard against ancient evils," Ulrik said, holding the dice where all could see. "Each time they are cast, they show different runes, different warnings, but always they point to the same truth, that Vargheim sits above something that must not be allowed to wake." He cast the dice onto the ground before the oak And Astrid watched with growing dread as symbols appeared on their surfaces, symbols she knew from her grandmother's teachings, symbols that spoke of binding and sacrifice and the thin walls between worlds. "Astrid Blackvein," Ulrik continued, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent gathering, "I ask for your hand in marriage, not from desire for wealth or alliance, but because our curses are connected. Because the binding that protects this village requires both warrior strength and guardian knowledge to maintain." Elder Bjorn sputtered in outrage. "This is madness. You would doom yourself for the sake of superstition and women's magic. I would save myself and this village for the sake of truth and necessity," Ulrik replied calmly. "The curse on my bloodline is no mere superstition. It has claimed my father, my grandfather, and every male heir for 7 generations. It feeds on the same darkness that Magnus died fighting. Together, Astrid and I might break what separately we can only endure." Astrid stared at the bone dice, at the shifting symbols that seemed to burn themselves into her vision. Everything. Ulrik spoke aligned with knowledge she had been taught, but never fully understood knowledge. Her grandmother had called the burden of the bloodline, the responsibility to guard against things that most people were blessed to forget existed. "And if you are wrong?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "If marriage to me brings only doom to another good man?" Ulrik's smile was sad but determined. "Then I will face that. Doom, knowing I chose to act rather than simply accept fate. Magnus stood against the darkness alone. I do not believe either of us needs to make that choice." The crowd stirred uneasily, torn between fear of the unknown and the compelling certainty in Ulrik's voice. Astrid felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge, felt the bloodstone pendant burning against her skin like a brand, felt the weight of generations of women who had carried this burden pressing down upon her shoulders. Finally, she spoke the words that would change everything. "I accept your proposal, Ulrik Skaldhammer, but know that what we undertake will test us in ways no mortal love was meant to endure." The gasps and murmurs that followed seemed to shake the very leaves of the great oak. Elder Bjorn raised his hands as if to speak some formal objection, but Ulrik gathered up the bone dice and stepped toward Astrid with purpose that brooked no interference. "Then let us face those tests together," he said, simply, "and discover what strength 2 cursed souls might find in unity." As the crowd began to disperse in worried clusters, whispering of doom and destiny, Astrid looked once more at the twisted death crown that had adorned her husband's brow. For the first time, she began to wonder if Magnus's death had been not the end of a tragedy, but the beginning of something far more dangerous and far more necessary than anyone in Vargheim had dared to imagine. The decision hung between them like morning mist, both substantial and fragile. In the days that followed the public proposal, Astrid found herself walking paths of memory she had long avoided, each step leading her deeper into questions that had no comfortable answers. She had agreed to marry Ulrik, but the weight of that choice pressed upon her like stones in a sinking ship. In the quiet hours before dawn, when even Runa's protective presence could not chase away the shadows, Astrid descended to the cellar beneath her. Longhouse, a place she had not visited since Magnus died. The hidden chamber lay behind a wall of ordinary storage shelves, accessible only to those who knew the proper sequence of pressure points carved into seemingly decorative wood. Her grandmother had shown her this place when she was barely 10 winters old, explaining in hushed tones that some knowledge was too dangerous for common daylight. Now, by the flickering light of a single oil lamp, Astrid knelt before the collection her bloodline had guarded for countless generations. The rune stones of binding lay scattered across a cloth of midnight blue, each carved from different materials: bone, stone, metal, and substances she could not identify. When her fingers brushed against them, they responded with warmth that had nothing to do with fire, pulsing with an inner light that made the carved symbols seem to writhe and dance. These stones held power to bind or break family curses, but the knowledge of their proper use had died with her grandmother. Astrid had only fragments of understanding, pieces of a puzzle that Magnus had died trying to solve. The memories came unbidden as she touched each stone. Magnus in their early days, laughing as he taught her to braid his beard in the style of Jarls. Magnus, bringing her wildflowers from the mountain meadows, his eyes bright with the joy of new love. Magnus holding her close during winter storms, whispering promises of spring and children and long years together. But then the darker memories, Magnus waking screaming from dreams he could never quite remember, speaking of whispers that came from beneath the earth and shadows that moved wrong. She had tried to help him with her grandmother's knowledge, had attempted rituals of protection and cleansing, but every effort seemed to make his condition worse. The night he died, Magnus had been trying to use these very stones, attempting a binding ritual he barely understood. She found him the next morning with several of the stones clutched in his hands, their surfaces still warm with residual power, and his wedding ring blackened as if touched by fire from another world. "My lady," Runa's voice drifted down from above, carefully respectful but tinged with concern. "I am here," Astrid called softly, gathering the stones back into their protective cloth. The lamp flame flickered as she climbed the narrow stairs, leaving the hidden chamber to its ancient silence. She found Runa in the main room, preparing the morning meal with movements made efficient by decades of practice. But there was tension in the older woman's shoulders, a wariness that spoke of sleepless nights and worried thoughts. "You have been in the chamber," Runa observed without judgment. "The stones call to you? They whisper of things I do not understand," Astrid admitted, settling beside the fire with the cloth-wrapped bundle in her hands. Magnus tried to use them, but he lacked the bloodline knowledge. "I fear the same ignorance will doom Ulrik if I cannot find the proper understanding." Runa set down her wooden spoon and turned fully toward her mistress, her weathered face grave with concern. "There are things about your husband's death that I have not spoken, my lady. Things I hoped would die with him." The words sent cold tendrils of dread through Astrid's chest. What things? The nightmares that plagued him, they were not random terrors. Runa's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. He spoke to me of them in his final weeks, when the fear had grown too great to bear alone. He said something was calling to him from beneath Vargheim, something that knew his name and the names of all his bloodline. Astrid's hand moved instinctively to the bloodstone pendant at her throat. "Why did you not tell me this before?" "Because you carried enough guilt without adding mine to the burden," Runa replied simply, "and because I hoped that with his death the calling would cease. But now this, the warrior comes speaking of connected curses and bloodline bindings, and I fear we face something larger than one man's tragedy." The truth of it settled over Astrid like a heavy cloak. Whatever had killed Magnus was still present, still waiting, and now it might set its attention upon Ulrik. The thought of watching another good man succumb to forces beyond his understanding was almost unbearable. As if summoned by her thoughts, a knock came at the door, firm but respectful, carrying the particular rhythm that had become familiar over the past few days. Ulrik had taken to visiting each morning, always proper in his behavior but persistent in his courtship. Today, however, something in the quality of his knock suggested urgency beyond mere social calling. When Runa opened the door, they found Ulrik standing in the morning light, but his usual composed demeanor was shattered. Dark circles shadowed his pale blue eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he gripped the doorframe for support. "The dreams have started," he said without preamble, his voice rough with exhaustion and fear. Astrid rose quickly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What kind of dreams?" "The kind that feel more real than waking," Ulrik replied, stepping into the warmth of her home. "Whispers from beneath the earth, calling my name and the names of my fathers. Shadows that move with purpose and intent. And always, always the sense of something vast and hungry, waiting just beyond sight." The description matched too perfectly with what Runa had revealed about Magnus's final weeks. Astrid felt the rune stones grow warm through their protective cloth, as if they recognized the presence of the curse they were meant to bind. "How long have you been experiencing them?" she asked. 3 nights, since I made the proposal public." Ulrik's laugh held no humor. "It seems that declaring my intentions has drawn unwanted attention." Astrid exchanged a meaningful glance with Runa, seeing her own fears reflected in the older woman's eyes. If the entity, for surely that was what they faced, could reach across the village to influence Ulrik's dreams, then its power was far greater than she had imagined. "There is something you must understand about these dreams," Astrid said carefully. "They are not mere visions, they are a form of contact. Whatever speaks to you from beneath the earth is real, and it grows stronger each time you listen." Ulrik's face grew grim with understanding. "Then time is not our ally." "No," Astrid agreed. "It is not. If we are to break both our curses before they consume us, we must move quickly. The marriage itself may be our only protection. The binding of our bloodlines might provide strength enough to resist what separately we cannot." "Then let us marry as soon as the rites can be arranged," Ulrik said, with the decisive manner of a man accustomed to battlefield decisions. "I have faced many enemies, but none that could reach into my dreams and speak my true name." Astrid felt the weight of decision settling upon her shoulders like a mantle of leadership. Everything her grandmother had taught her about the burden of their bloodline was crystallizing into immediate necessity. The knowledge she carried, fragmented as it might be, was their only hope against forces that had already claimed too many good men. "Very well," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her heart. "But understand this, Ulrik Skaldhammer, once we are wed, there will be no turning back from the path we choose. The entity that killed Magnus will see our union as a threat, and it will respond accordingly." "Let it come," Ulrik replied, but his bravado was tempered by the exhaustion that lined his face. "At least, we will face it together." As they began to plan for a wedding that would be as much ritual protection as celebration, Astrid could not shake the feeling that somewhere beneath their feet something ancient and malevolent had begun to stir with renewed purpose. The wedding preparations began under a sky the color of old pewter, with clouds that seemed to press down upon Vargheim like the lid of a great cauldron. Despite the village's unease, or perhaps because of it, Astrid insisted on observing all the proper customs. If they were to face something ancient and powerful, they would do so with the full blessing of tradition behind them. But first, she had conditions. "You must understand what you are asking of me," Astrid told Ulrik as they sat in her longhouse 3 days after his nightmare revelation. Between them, on the wooden table, lay the seer's bone dice, their yellowed surfaces catching the firelight and showing different symbols with each flicker of flame. "Marriage to me is not simply a union of 2 people. It is acceptance into a burden that has been carried by my bloodline for more generations than anyone can count." Ulrik leaned forward, his massive hands clasped before Tim. The dark circles under his eyes had deepened despite Astrid's attempts to ward his dreams with simple protection charms, but his resolve remained unshaken. "Tell me what I need to know." Astrid rose and moved to a wooden chest that had belonged to her grandmother, extracting a bundle wrapped in silk the color of midnight. As she unwrapped it, revealing ancient scrolls covered in runic script, the air in the room seemed to thicken with the weight of old knowledge. "My grandmother called us the Thread Keepers," she began, her voice taking on the cadence of ritual recitation. "We are the women who remember what others have chosen to forget, who guard the knowledge needed to keep ancient evils bound. But knowledge without understanding is dangerous, and understanding without wisdom is fatal." She unrolled the first scroll, showing Ulrik symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the lamplight. "These are the binding runes that have kept the entity beneath Vargheim sleeping for generations. My grandmother knew their meanings, but she died before she could teach me everything. I have fragments, pieces of a greater whole that Magnus tried to complete." Ulrik studied the symbols with the intensity of a warrior examining enemy fortifications. "And my curse?" How does it connect to what lies beneath? That is what the seer's dice have been trying to tell us. Astrid replied, casting the bone cubes onto the table's surface. New symbols appeared, some matching those on the ancient scrolls, others foreign and troubling. Your bloodline was bound to the entity long ago, made into a key that could either strengthen its prison or unlock its bonds entirely. Each male heir carries the potential to either save or damn us all. The words hung between them like smoke from a dying fire. Ulrik reached out to touch one of the dice, and Astrid gasped as the symbols blazed with sudden light, showing images that hurt to look at directly: ancient battles, binding rituals, and the faces of men who bore a striking resemblance to Ulrik himself. 7 generations, Ulrik said quietly, understanding dawning in his pale blue eyes. 7 men who died fighting something they could not defeat alone. But you are not alone, Astrid said, covering his hand with hers. The contact sent warmth through both of them, and the symbols on the dice settled into patterns of protection rather than warning. That is what the seer understood, what my grandmother tried to teach me. The binding requires both guardian knowledge and warrior strength, combined through bonds deeper than blood. Over the following days, as news of their impending marriage spread through Vargheim like ripples in a disturbed pond, strange incidents began to occur throughout the village. Livestock grew restless and refused to eat, their eyes rolling white with terror at things only they could see. Children woke screaming from nightmares they could not remember. Wells that had run clear for generations began producing water that tasted of metal and earth. Most disturbing of all was the behavior of the village dogs. The normally friendly animals grew aggressive and fearful, gathering in packs that prowled the edges of the settlement as if guarding against some approaching threat. They would not go near the center of Vargheim, where the great oak stood, and they howled mournfully through the long nights. The bindings are weakening, Astrid explained to Ulrik as they observed the strange behavior from her window. The entity knows what we plan, and it is testing the boundaries of its prison. Ulrik's response was to begin teaching Astrid the practical aspects of their coming partnership. If they were to face an ancient evil together, she would need more than mystical knowledge to survive. A guardian's wisdom is powerful, he said as he showed her how to properly grip a seax, the long knife that every Norse woman carried. But wisdom without the ability to defend oneself is merely interesting last words. They practiced in the privacy of her courtyard, where curious eyes could not witness the widow learning warrior skills from her betrothed. Astrid discovered that her years of carrying the bloodstone pendant and working with the binding runes had given her reflexes sharper than those of ordinary women. She could sense movement before it happened, could feel the intention behind an attack like heat from a forge. "You have guardian instincts," Ulrik observed after she successfully dodged a practice blow that should have been impossible to avoid. "Your bloodline has bred traits that complement mine." But it was during one of these training sessions that they encountered their first real opposition from within the village itself. Erik Ironsson, Ulrik's younger brother, arrived unannounced with 3 of his closest companions, all young warriors who had grown up hearing tales of Ulrik's legendary prowess in battle. Erik was a man of 30, winters, with the same auburn hair as his brother, but none of Ulrik's patient wisdom. Where Ulrik moved with the controlled power of mountains, Erik possessed the restless energy of summer storms, quick to anger, slow to forgive, and absolutely convinced of his own righteousness. "Brother," Erik said, his voice carrying the edge of barely controlled fury, "I come to speak sense before you commit an act of madness that will doom our entire bloodline." Ulrik set down his practiced sword and faced Erik with the weary patience of an elder dealing with a willful child. "And what madness would that be? Marriage to the witch who killed Jarl Magnus," Erik spat, his companions nodding agreement behind him. "The whole village speaks of the strange happenings since you announced this cursed union. Animals going mad, children plagued by nightmares, water turning foul, all signs that the widow's corruption spreads to encompass even you." Astrid felt the bloodstone pendant grow warm against her throat, responding to the hostility directed toward her. But more troubling was the expression in Erik's eyes, not merely anger or fear, but a glassy intensity that spoke of influence from something beyond his own emotions. "Erik," Ulrik said carefully, "when did these concerns about my marriage first occur to you?" "They came to me in dreams," Erik replied, his voice taking on a strange, distant quality. "Clear visions of our bloodline corrupted, of ancient honors befouled by witch magic. The voices of our fathers speak to me from beyond death, warning against this folly." The words sent ice through Astrid's veins. If the entity could reach beyond Ulrik to influence his family, then their danger was far greater than she had imagined. But before she could speak, Ulrik stepped forward with the decisive authority of an older brother accustomed to command. "The voices you hear are not those of our fathers," he said firmly. "They are the whispers of something that would use your love for our family to destroy everything we hope to protect. You must not listen to them." But Erik was already backing away, his face twisted with a mixture of disgust and pity. "You are lost to us, brother. The witch has claimed your mind as surely as she claimed Magnus's life. When the curse consumes you, remember that you chose this fate." As Erik and his companions departed, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with threat and betrayal, Astrid realized that their enemy possessed a cunning that went beyond mere supernatural power. It could turn love into fear, family bonds into weapons, and hope into the very instrument of destruction. The wedding could not come soon enough, but she began to wonder if even the binding of their bloodlines would be sufficient to face something that could corrupt the very relationships they sought to protect. The wedding took place on a morning when the mist rose from the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, wrapping Vargheim in a shroud of grey that muffled sound and softened edges until the world seemed caught between dream and waking. Despite the village's unease, or perhaps because of it, Astrid had insisted on a ceremony that honored every tradition their people held sacred. She wore her grandmother's wedding dress, ivory wool embroidered with silver threads that caught what little light filtered through the morning haze. The bloodstone pendant lay against her throat like a drop of fire, and her dark hair was braided with ribbons the color of winter sky. But it was the binding sword that drew the most attention, Ulrik's family blade, passed down through 7 generations, now cold and heavy in his grip, as if the very metal rebelled against its purpose. The sword should have been warm with the touch of its rightful wielder, should have sung with eagerness for battle as it had for his fathers before him. Instead, it lay lifeless in Ulrik's hands, its blade dull despite careful polishing, its edge unable to draw. True blood, no matter how sharp the whetstone made it. The curse upon his bloodline had even claimed his weapon, turning a warrior's most trusted companion into little more than elaborate decoration. Elder Bjorn performed the ceremony with grim efficiency, his weathered face showing none of the joy that should have accompanied the union of 2 noble houses. The traditional words of binding fell from his lips like stones into still water, each phrase weighted with the accumulated disapproval of a village that feared what this marriage might bring. "By the roots of Yggdrasil and the wisdom of the All-Father," Bjorn intoned, "let these 2 souls be bound as one, their fates intertwined until the ending of all things." As Ulrik slipped the wedding ring onto Astrid's finger, a band of silver carved with protective runes, she felt something shift in the very fabric of reality around them. The bloodstone pendant flared with sudden warmth, and for a moment the binding sword in Ulrik's grip seemed to pulse with returning life. The assembled villagers stepped back as one, sensing forces at work beyond their understanding. But the moment of harmony was shattered by a child's scream from the edge of the village. Young Tormund, barely 8 winters old, came running toward the wedding party with his face white with terror and his small hands clutched to his head. Behind him ran his mother, Sigrid the baker, her own features twisted with panic as she tried to catch her fleeing son. "The voices!" Tormund shrieked, his words carrying clearly across the suddenly silent gathering. "They're so loud, Mama. They're telling me things about the dark place under the ground." Astrid felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. If the entity could reach a child so young, if it could speak directly into innocent minds, then their situation was far more desperate than she had imagined. She started toward the boy, but Ulrik's hand closed gently on her arm. "Let me," he said quietly, and there was something in his voice that spoke of hard-won experience with frightened children and the aftermath of supernatural terror. Ulrik knelt before young Tormund, making himself less imposing as he placed his large hands carefully on the boy's shoulders. "The voices are lies, little warrior. They speak only to frighten you into believing things that are not true." "But they know my name," Tormund whispered, his young face creased with confusion and fear. "They know Mama's name too, and they say they've been waiting so long for someone to listen." The words sent murmurs of unease through the wedding party, but Astrid saw something else in Ulrik's expression: recognition, understanding, and a grim determination that spoke of personal experience with exactly this kind of supernatural influence. "I know about the voices," Ulrik said gently, his voice carrying the authority of truth. "They have spoken to me as well, and to my fathers before me, but here is what they do not want you to know: they cannot touch you if you refuse to believe them." As he spoke, Ulrik reached into his tunic and drew forth a small iron pendant, unremarkable except for the runes carved into its surface. He placed it around Tormund's neck, and immediately the boy's expression cleared, the terrible tension leaving his small frame like air escaping from a punctured bladder. "Iron blessed with guardian runes," Ulrik explained as Sigrid gathered her son into grateful arms. "It will protect him from whispers that do not belong in young ears." But even as relief spread through the gathered villagers, Astrid felt a growing sense of dread. The entity's ability to reach children meant it was growing stronger, testing the boundaries of its ancient prison with increasing boldness. And if it could influence someone as innocent as Tormund, how many others in Vargheim were vulnerable to its corrupting whispers? The remainder of the wedding ceremony proceeded under a cloud of tension that no amount of traditional celebration could dispel. When Elder Bjorn finally pronounced them husband and wife, the words felt less like a blessing than a declaration of war against forces that cared nothing for human happiness or hope. The wedding feast that followed was a subdued affair, held in the great hall that had once echoed with Magnus's laughter, but now seemed filled with shadows that moved wrong in the flickering torchlight. Astrid sat beside her new husband, acutely aware of how the villagers watched them, not with the usual good-natured ribbing that accompanied new marriages, but with the wary attention of people observing a potentially dangerous experiment. It was during the feast that the first true test of their united strength came. Erik arrived with more companions than before, nearly a dozen young warriors, all bearing the same glassy-eyed intensity that spoke of supernatural influence. They took positions around the hall's perimeter, not quite threatening, but clearly prepared for confrontation. "Brother," Erik called across the hall, his voice carrying an unnatural resonance that made several people wince. "I have come to offer you one final chance to see reason before it is too late to save our bloodline from corruption." Ulrik rose slowly, the binding sword at his hip still cold and lifeless, but his bearing that of a man prepared to defend what was precious to him. "And what reason would you have me see? The reason of our ancestors, who knew the price of trafficking with forces beyond mortal understanding." Erik's companions began to move forward, forming a loose circle around the high table where Astrid and Ulrik sat. "Divorce this witch before her curse claims you, as it claimed Magnus. Return to the path of honor that our fathers walked." But as Erik spoke, Astrid felt the bloodstone pendant growing warm against her throat, responding to a presence that had nothing to do with Ulrik's brother and everything to do with the malevolent intelligence that lay beneath Vargheim. She could see it now, the way the shadows seemed to cluster around Erik and his companions, the way their eyes reflected light that came from no earthly source. "You are not my brother," Ulrik said with quiet certainty that cut through the supernatural influence like a blade through silk. You wear his face and speak with his voice, but the words come from something that has no understanding of family bonds or warrior honor. The accusation hit Eric like a physical blow, and for a moment his expression flickered between confusion and fury. But then the glassy intensity returned, stronger than before, and when he spoke again it was with a voice that carried echoes of vast spaces and ancient hunger. "Your brother is still here," the entity said through Eric's mouth. "But he sleeps now, dreams now, of the glory that awaits when the old bindings finally break. Soon, all of Vargheim will share his dreams, will understand the futility of fighting what has already won." As the possessed warriors began to close their circle, Astrid reached for Ulrik's hand and felt the binding sword suddenly flare to life, its blade catching fire from sources beyond mortal understanding. The entity had made its first direct move against them, but in doing so, it had also revealed the true power of their union, the strength that came from guardian knowledge and warrior courage, combined in bonds that even ancient evil could not easily break. The confrontation in the Great Hall ended without bloodshed, but only because the entity withdrew its influence as suddenly as it had asserted it. Eric and his companions blinked in confusion, their glassy-eyed intensity fading to leave behind only bewildered young men who remembered challenging their war leader, but could not quite recall why. The possessed warriors dispersed into the night, leaving behind an atmosphere thick with unspoken threats and the bitter taste of supernatural corruption. In the privacy of Astrid's longhouse now, their shared home, she finally revealed the full truth of her heritage to her new husband. The mirror of truth lay between them on the wooden table, its polished bronze surface reflecting not their physical forms, but something far more profound and disturbing. "Look," Astrid said softly, her hand covering Ulrik's as they gazed into the ancient artifact. "See what we truly are." The mirror's surface rippled like disturbed water, then cleared to show images that made Ulrik draw in a sharp breath. He saw himself not as the mighty warrior others perceived, but as a man wrapped in chains of shadow that bound his spirit as surely as iron shackles might bind his flesh. The chains pulsed with malevolent life, connecting him to something vast and hungry that lurked beneath the earth. But around Astrid flowed patterns of silver light, weaving through the air like threads in a cosmic loom. Where her light touched Ulrik's shadowy bonds, the chains grew, thinner, weaker, as if her very presence worked to dissolve what had held his bloodline captive for generations. "My grandmother called our line the Thread Keepers," Astrid explained, her voice taking on the ritual cadence of ancient teaching. "We are the daughters of women who made a bargain in the elder days to bind our bloodlines to the guardianship of places where reality grows thin, where ancient things sleep uneasily beneath the world." Ulrik studied their reflections with the intensity of a tactician examining battlefield maps. "And my family? How do we fit into this web of guardianship?" "Your bloodline was chosen as the key," Astrid replied, her fingers tracing patterns in the air that left brief trails of silver light. "Not to unlock the entity's prison, but to strengthen it. Each generation of your family was meant to add their warrior strength to the binding, to serve as guardians alongside the Thread Keepers." "But something went wrong," Ulrik observed, watching how the shadowy chains in the mirror pulsed with increasing agitation. "Yes, 7 generations ago, your ancestor Grimvar the Bold made a different choice. Instead of accepting the burden of guardianship, he sought to break free from it entirely. His attempt to sever the binding corrupted it, turning what should have been a source of strength into a curse that devoured his descendants. The mirror showed them flashes of the past, Grimvar in his pride, attempting rituals he did not understand, and the terrible consequence as the protective binding became a conduit for the very force it was meant to contain. Each subsequent generation of Ulrik's family had died fighting shadows of their own making, warriors destroyed by the very strength that should have protected their people. Magnus discovered part of this truth, Astrid continued, her voice heavy with old grief. He tried to restore the proper binding, but he lacked both the guardian knowledge and the warrior heritage needed to succeed. The attempt killed him, but it also weakened the entity's hold enough for you to find your way here. Over the days that followed their wedding, Astrid began teaching Ulrik the deeper mysteries of their shared burden. In the hidden chamber beneath her longhouse, surrounded by artifacts that hummed with power older than kingdoms, she showed him how to read the binding runes and understand the delicate balance that kept ancient evil at bay. The entity feeds on fear and despair, she explained, as they studied scrolls that depicted the original binding ritual. Every nightmare it sends, every whisper of corruption it spreads, makes it stronger. But it also hungers for something more, the warrior strength of your bloodline and the guardian knowledge of mine. United in willing partnership, Ulrik's education progressed with the intensity of a man learning skills needed for immediate survival. He mastered the basic protection runes quickly, his warrior's discipline serving him, well in memorizing complex patterns and their meanings. But more challenging was learning to sense the subtle flows of power that moved through Vargheim like underground rivers. Feel with more than your physical senses. Astrid guided him as they practiced in the stone circle behind her longhouse. The entity's influence leaves traces cold, spots where warmth should be, shadows that fall wrong regardless of the sun's position, a taste in the air like copper and old earth. As Ulrik's sensitivity to supernatural forces grew, so did his understanding of how thoroughly the entity had infiltrated their community. Nearly a third of Vargheim's population showed signs of influence, subtle changes in behavior, unexplained fears, and dreams filled with whispers from beneath the earth. The most disturbing discovery came when they tested the village children for susceptibility to supernatural influence. Young Tormund, despite Ulrik's protective pendant, still heard the voices in quiet moments. 3 other children showed similar symptoms, and 2 of the village women had begun experiencing the vivid nightmares that had plagued Magnus in his final weeks. It grows stronger, Astrid observed as they documented each case of influence. Our marriage has forced it to act more directly, but it has also revealed how far its corruption has already spread. The crisis came when they attempted their first joint ritual, a simple blessing meant to cleanse the village well that had been producing tainted water. Working together, their combined power should have easily purified what the entity had corrupted. Instead, their efforts triggered a violent response that shook the very foundations of Vargheim. The ground beneath the village trembled as if something vast had stirred in its sleep. Windows cracked in their frames, livestock screamed in terror, and the great oak at the village centre began to wither as if touched by winter in the midst of summer. Most terrifying of all, every person showing signs of influence collapsed simultaneously, speaking in unison with a voice that came from no human throat. You cannot unmake what has already been woven. The entity spoke through a dozen mouths at once. The binding weakens with each passing year, and soon I shall reclaim what was stolen from me in the elder days. Your little marriage changes nothing. It merely adds your strength to mine when the final breaking comes. When the possessed villagers finally returned to awareness, they remembered nothing of what had occurred. But the message had been clear. The entity no longer saw Astrid and Ulrik as a threat to be corrupted, but as resources to be harvested when the time was right. That night, as they held each other in the darkness of their marriage bed, both understood that they had moved beyond the possibility of simple solutions. The entity's power was growing too quickly, its influence spreading too widely for gradual approaches to succeed. We need to understand what it really is, Ulrik said quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind that howled through the gaps in their walls. Not just what it wants, but what it was before the binding, why it was imprisoned beneath Vargheim in the first place. Astrid's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that had become both comfort and promise. Then we must seek the oldest knowledge, the memories that were deemed too dangerous for ordinary keeping. My grandmother hinted at such things, hidden deeper than the binding runes, protected by guardianships that have never been broken. And if those guardianships were meant to protect us from knowledge we cannot safely possess, then we must hope, Astrid replied. That necessity makes us worthy of burdens our ancestors thought too great to bear. Outside their window, the village dogs had begun to howl again, their voices joining in a lament that seemed to echo from somewhere far, beneath the earth. Whatever ancient evil stirred in the darkness below Vargheim, it knew that its long patience was finally drawing to an end. The revelation came from the deepest vault beneath Astrid's longhouse, in a chamber she had never known existed until the void crystal called to her in dreams. The black stone lay hidden behind a wall that appeared solid until touched by hands, carrying both guardian blood and warrior heritage, a lock that could only be opened by their union. When their combined touch dissolved the ancient barrier, the chamber beyond took Astrid's breath away. Here were records that predated her grandmother's collection by centuries, scrolls and tablets carved in runic scripts so old they seemed to writhe and shift in the lamplight. But at the center of it all sat the void crystal, a sphere of absolute darkness that absorbed light without reflection, its surface showing visions that challenged everything they thought they understood. Magnus, Astrid, whispered as the crystal revealed its first terrible truth. In the stone's depths, they watched her first husband's final night unfold with perfect clarity. But this was not the story the village had told itself, not the tale of a man consumed by supernatural corruption until death claimed him. Instead, they saw Magnus as he truly was in those last hours, not victim, but hero. The crystal showed Magnus descending to this very chamber, guided by fragments of knowledge Astrid had shared without understanding their true significance. He had come seeking the power to break the curse that plagued his nightmares, but what he discovered was far more terrible than any personal affliction. "Look deeper," Ulrik said quietly, his hand covering Astrid's as they both gazed into the crystal's revelations. See what he saw. The vision shifted, showing them Vargheim as it appeared through Magnus's eyes on that final night. But instead of the peaceful village above, Magnus perceived the truth that lay beneath a vast network of corruption spreading like infection through the very foundations of their community. The entity had not been sleeping peacefully in its prison. It had been working, slowly and patiently, to turn the village itself into a conduit for its escape. Every nightmare, every unexplained fear, every small cruelty that had taken root in Vargheim over the decades, all of it had been the entity's influence, subtle as poison in a well, changing the very nature of the community from within. The binding that was meant to contain it had instead become a feeding tube, allowing it to taste the emotions and dreams of everyone who lived above its prison. Magnus had understood what no one else could see, that the corruption was not coming from outside Vargheim, but had been growing within it for generations. The village they all loved and protected was slowly becoming an extension of the entity itself, a trap that would eventually consume every soul within its boundaries. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. As the crystal showed them Magnus's desperate attempt to strengthen the failing binding, Astrid saw something that made her gasp aloud. Her first husband had not died from the entity's curse at all. He had died from exposure to the binding ritual's true nature, his mortal frame unable to contain the pure guardian power he had tried to channel without the bloodline. Heritage needed to survive it. He was trying to become what I am, Astrid realized, her voice thick with grief and understanding. He was attempting to transform himself into a thread keeper, to take on the burden that should have been mine to bear. The void crystal showed them more. Magnus's discovery that Astrid's reluctance to fully embrace her heritage had created a gap in the village's defenses. He had seen how the entity exploited her guilt over powers she feared to use, how it fed on her self-doubt and turned her greatest strength into a source of weakness. So he tried to fill that gap himself, Ulrik said, with the grim admiration of one warrior recognizing another's sacrifice. He died not as a victim of supernatural forces, but as a guardian who gave his life to buy time for the real solution to be found. But the crystal's revelations were far from finished. As they watched in growing horror, they saw the true scope of what they faced. The entity beneath Vargheim was not some mindless force of destruction. It was ancient, cunning, and possessed of intelligence that had spent millennia studying the weaknesses of human nature. It had orchestrated everything: Magnus's death, Astrid's isolation, the village's fear and mistrust. Even Ulrik's arrival had been part of its grand design, guided by whispers planted in the dying seer's mind years before. The entity wanted them married, wanted their bloodlines united, because their combined power was exactly what it needed to finally break free from its prison. "We have been dancing to its tune from the very beginning," Astrid said, her voice hollow with the realization of how thoroughly they had been manipulated. "Everything we thought was our choice, our defiance of fate. It has all been part of the entity's plan." The void crystal showed them the end game, the purpose behind centuries of patient manipulation. When their combined power reached its peak, when guardian knowledge and warrior strength were perfectly balanced, the entity would corrupt their bond as it had corrupted Grimvar's binding ritual. Their love would become a conduit for its escape, their unity transformed into the key that unlocked its ancient prison. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm them, the crystal revealed one more truth, one that even the entity had not anticipated. In the deepest vision, they saw not what had been or what was planned to be, but what could be if they found the courage to rewrite the very foundations of their reality. Magnus had not simply died. Trying to become a threadkeeper, he had succeeded at the cost of his mortal life. His spirit, transformed by the guardian power he had absorbed, remained bound to Vargheim, not as a haunting presence, but as a protective force. He had become something new, something the entity had no knowledge of, and therefore no defense against. "He is still here," Astrid whispered, tears streaming down her face as she finally understood the true nature of her first husband's sacrifice. Still protecting the village, still fighting the entity from within, the binding itself. The revelation changed everything. They were not alone in their struggle, had never been alone. Magnus had transformed himself into a guardian spirit, using his death as the foundation for a new kind of binding one, that drew power not from ancient rituals, but from the willing sacrifice of love itself. But Magnus's protection was fading. The energy that sustained his spirit was finite, drawn from the love he had shared with Astrid and the loyalty he felt toward his people. Soon that energy would be exhausted, and when it failed, nothing would stand between the entity and its freedom. "How long do we have?" Ulrik asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer would not be comfortable. The void crystal pulsed once, showing them visions of Vargheim as it would exist in 3 days' time: empty houses, scattered bones, and a great darkness rising from beneath the earth to spread across the land like a plague of shadows. The entity had grown patient over millennia, but Magnus's unexpected interference had forced it to accelerate its plans. 3 days, Astrid confirmed, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they faced. 3 days before Magnus's protection fails completely and the entity breaks free to claim not just Vargheim, but every settlement within 100 leagues. But even as they absorbed the terrible knowledge of their situation, another realization began to form. The entity's plan depended on corrupting their bond, as it had corrupted the original binding. It expected them to love each other as mortals loved, with all the fears and weaknesses that made human affection vulnerable to supernatural manipulation. What it had not anticipated was the possibility that their love might transcend mortal limitations, that guardian heritage and warrior strength, united by true understanding rather than mere attraction, might create something entirely new, something even more powerful than Magnus's spirit binding, but infinitely more dangerous to attempt. "There is another way," Astrid said slowly, her mind racing through possibilities that her grandmother's teachings had only hinted at. A way to turn the entity's own plan against it, to use its expectation of corruption as the foundation for its own destruction. "Tell me," Ulrik said simply. "We give it exactly what it wants," Astrid replied, her voice carrying the cold certainty of a woman who had finally found her true purpose. "We unite our bloodlines completely, without reservation or protection. We become the key it needs to break free, and then we break that key from within, destroying both the lock and what it was meant to contain." The plan that began to form between them was more dangerous than any battle, more demanding than any sacrifice. But as they sat in the chamber where Magnus had died, trying to save them all, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of generations, they finally understood that some victories could only be won by those willing to risk everything for love that transcended the merely mortal. The sundering blade revealed itself on the second day, when their desperate search through the deepest archives finally uncovered the weapon that existed between legend and necessity. Unlike the binding sword that hung cold at Ulrik's hip, this ancient artifact had never known the touch of mortal hands, forged not by earthly smiths, but by forces that understood the delicate art of cutting through the very fabric of magical bonds. Astrid found it wrapped in cloth that crumbled to dust at her touch, hidden in a vault her grandmother had never mentioned, and sealed with wards that recognized only the most desperate need. The blade itself seemed made of crystallized starlight, translucent and sharp beyond mortal comprehension, its edge capable of severing connections that existed purely in the realm of spirit and power. "It will cut through anything," Astrid explained as she and Ulrik examined the impossible weapon. "Not just flesh and bone, but bonds of curse and binding, connections between spirit and flesh, the links that hold souls to their earthly forms. In the right hands, it can unmake the very foundations of magical workings." Ulrik studied the weapon with the careful attention of a man whose life had always depended on understanding the tools of his trade. And in the wrong hands, it would cut through the wielder as easily as any enemy, Astrid replied grimly. "The sundering blade requires both guardian knowledge to direct its power and warrior strength to contain it. Neither of us could wield it alone, but together, with our bloodlines properly united, we might have the strength to use it without being destroyed in the process." The plan that had begun to form in the void crystal chamber now took on desperate urgency. They would allow the entity to corrupt their bond, as it intended, let it use their united power as the key to break free from its ancient prison. But at the moment of the entity's triumph, when it was most confident and therefore most vulnerable, they would turn the sundering blade upon the corrupted binding itself, severing not just the entity's connection to their world, but its very existence. The risk was almost incomprehensible. If they failed, if the blade's power proved insufficient, or their timing was wrong by even a heartbeat, the entity would be free to spread across the land like a pataport, plague of shadows, consuming every settlement and corrupting every soul it touched. But if they succeeded, the entity would be destroyed utterly, its threat ended forever at the cost of their own lives. "We will not survive the severing," Astrid said quietly as they made their final preparations. "The blade will cut through our bond to destroy the entity, but that same cutting will unmake us as well. Our bodies may live, but the connection that makes us who we are will be gone forever." Ulrik's response was to take her hand in his, their fingers intertwining with a familiarity that felt strange given the brief time of their actual marriage. "Then we must make these last hours count for something beyond mere survival." The village evacuation began at dawn on the third day, though few of the villagers understood the true nature of what they fled. Elder Bjorn had argued against abandoning Vargheim entirely, but when the void crystal showed him visions of what would happen if the entity escaped, He became their most ardent supporter in convincing others to leave. "Tell them it is a precaution," Astrid instructed as families loaded their most precious possessions onto carts and prepared for the journey to distant settlements. "Tell them the strange happenings have grown too dangerous to ignore. Do not speak of what lies beneath. There are some truths that would only add to their terror without helping them escape." But not everyone could be convinced to leave. A handful of the village's most stubborn residents refused to abandon homes their families had held for generations, and 3 of the affected individuals, those showing the strongest signs of the entity's influence, seemed unable to leave at all, as if invisible chains bound them to the corrupted ground. Most surprising was Runa's decision to remain. Astrid's faithful servant, who had spent decades protecting her mistress from all manner of earthly threats, now revealed herself as something more than a simple household retainer. "I am the last of my line, as you are of yours," Runa said, when Astrid pleaded with her to flee with the others. "My grandmother served your grandmother, and her grandmother served before that. We are not just servants, my lady. We are the watchers who ensure the threadkeepers never face their burdens alone." The revelation that Runa carried her own form of guardian heritage explained much about the older woman's uncanny ability to sense supernatural threats and her deep understanding of the family traditions. But it also meant that she, like Magnus before her, was willing to sacrifice herself to ensure Astrid had every possible chance of success. "The ritual will require an anchor," Runa explained as she helped prepare the tools they would need for their desperate gambit. "Someone to hold the protective wards while you and Ulrik allow yourselves to be corrupted by the entity's influence. I cannot wield the sundering blade, but I can ensure it remains untainted long enough for you to use it." Eric's return brought both redemption and additional complexity to their preparations. Ulrik's brother arrived in the early afternoon, no longer bearing the glassy-eyed intensity of supernatural influence, but clearly marked by his experiences under the entity's control. "I remember everything," Eric said when he found them in the hidden chamber beneath Astrid's longhouse. "Every word it spoke through my mouth, every thought it planted in my mind. The entity showed me visions of what it plans to do when it escapes, how it will spread its corruption across all the northern lands until every village becomes an extension of its hunger." The memories had changed Eric, profoundly. Where once he had been quick to anger and slow to forgive, now he spoke with the measured words of a man who had seen the true face of evil and understood the price of opposing it. "I cannot undo the harm I caused," Eric continued, his voice heavy with guilt and determination. "But I can stand with you when the final moment comes. The entity expects you to face it alone. Another supporter might provide the advantage you need." Astrid looked at Ulrik, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his pale blue eyes. They had planned for a ritual that would require perfect balance between their 2 bloodlines, but Eric's offer introduced new possibilities and new risks. "The entity knows you," Astrid warned. "It has touched your mind directly, influenced your thoughts and dreams. If you remain when we attempt the binding, it might use that connection to corrupt the ritual before we can complete it." "Then we must hope," Eric replied with a faint smile that reminded Astrid why Ulrik loved his brother despite their differences, "that my warrior's training proves stronger than supernatural influence." The final preparations took on the solemnity of funeral rites, each detail attended to with the care of those who knew they might not live to see another sunset. Astrid donned her grandmother's ceremonial robes, deep blue wool, embroidered with silver threads that formed protective patterns across the fabric. The bloodstone pendant lay heavy against her throat, pulsing with warmth that seemed to respond to the approaching confrontation. Ulrik armed himself, not just with the sundering blade, but with every protective charm and blessing their combined knowledge could provide. The binding sword remained at his hip, still cold and lifeless, but serving as a reminder of what they fought to restore. His ceremonial armor bore runes of strength and courage, carved by Runa's skilled hands in the final hours before the ritual. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the emptied village, they felt the entity stir in its prison far beneath their feet. The ground trembled with its awakening presence, and the air itself seemed to thicken with malevolent anticipation. "It knows the time has come," Astrid observed, as they made their way to the village center where the great oak stood, the tree that had served as Vargheim's heart for generations and would now become the focal point for either their greatest victory or most terrible defeat. The oak itself showed signs of the entity's influence, its leaves withering despite the warm weather, its mighty trunk bearing scars that had not been there the day before. But beneath the corruption, Astrid could sense something else. Magnus's protective presence, weakened but still fighting, still holding the entity's full power at bay for just a little longer. "Can you feel him?" she asked Ulrik as they approached the ancient tree. "I feel someone who loved you enough to die for the chance that you might succeed where he failed," Ulrik replied. "Someone who wants us to understand that some victories are worth any price." As they began to arrange the components needed for their ritual, the sundering blade, the binding runes, the protective circles that would either contain the entity's corruption or channel it into their own souls, the entity's voice rose from beneath the earth, like the rumble of distant thunder. At last, it whispered through stone and soil, its words vibrating in their bones. At last, the key turns, the lock opens, and the long imprisonment ends. "Come to me, Threadkeeper. Come to me, warrior heir. Come and fulfill the purpose for which you were born." Around them, Vargheim began to change as the entity's influence spread unchecked through the emptied village. Shadows lengthened without regard for the sun's position. The air grew thick with the scent of ancient earth and old decay, and the very stones of the buildings seemed to pulse with unnatural life. The final battle was about to begin, not a clash of sword and shield, but a test of love's power to transcend even the corruption of ancient evil. And at its heart lay a truth that neither Astrid nor Ulrik fully understood, yet that sometimes the greatest victories required the courage to become the very thing you fought against, trusting that love could survive even the deepest darkness. The heart of Vargheim cracked open as the entity began its final ascent. The mystical stone that had anchored the village for generations, a granite boulder carved with protective runes by the first settlers, split down its center with a sound like thunder rolling across mountain peaks. From the fissure poured darkness that moved with purpose and intelligence, shadows that reached toward the great oak with tendrils of pure malevolence. Astrid felt the moment like a physical blow, the bloodstone pendant burning against her throat as centuries of carefully maintained balance shattered in an instant. Beside her, Ulrik drew the sundering blade, its crystalline surface catching the last rays of sunlight and throwing them back in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "It comes," Runa called from her position at the edge of the protective circle she had drawn around the oak's massive trunk. Her weathered hands moved in complex patterns, weaving wards that glowed with silver light against the encroaching darkness. "I can hold the circle, but not for long once it reaches full strength." The entity that emerged from beneath Vargheim defied easy description. It was vast without being large, ancient without being old, hungry without possessing anything resembling a mouth. What Astrid saw was shadow given form and purpose, darkness that remembered what it had been before the first bindings were forged, when it had fed freely on the dreams and fears of mortal creatures. But Ulrik saw something different, a warrior's enemy made manifest, something that could be fought and defeated through courage and proper tactics. To him, the entity appeared as a giant wrapped in chains of shadow, its form shifting between the shapes of every warrior who had ever fallen to its influence, including faces that bore a disturbing resemblance to his own ancestors. "7 generations of my blood have fed its power," Ulrik said quietly, raising the sundering blade in a gesture of challenge. "Tonight that debt is paid in full." The entity's response was laughter that seemed to come from the earth itself, a sound that made the stones of Vargheim's buildings tremble and crack. When it spoke, its voice carried echoes of everyone it had ever influenced. Magnus's wisdom corrupted into cunning, Eric's passion twisted into rage, even whispers that sounded disturbingly like Astrid's own voice. "You understand nothing, little warriors," the entity said through a dozen remembered voices. "You think to face me with blade and magic, as if I were some simple beast to be slain. I am older than your kingdoms, deeper than your understanding. I am the hunger that dwells in every heart, the shadow that follows every light." As it spoke, the entity began to take more solid form, drawing substance from the very stones of the covenant village. Buildings crumbled as their essence was absorbed into its growing mass, and the protective runes carved into doorposts and foundation stones flared briefly before going dark forever. "The binding grows weak," Astrid observed, watching as cracks spread outward from the shattered heartstone. "Magnus's protection fails." Indeed, they could see Magnus's spirit now, a faint outline of silver light that flickered like a candle flame in a hurricane. His spectral form stood between them and the entity, still fighting even as his essence grew more translucent with each passing moment. But the sight of her first husband's sacrificial struggle gave Astrid the clarity she needed to begin their desperate plan. Drawing upon knowledge that had been passed down through countless generations of threadkeepers, she began to weave the corruption ritual, the working that would deliberately open her soul to the entity's influence. "Magnus," she whispered, knowing his spirit could hear her. "Even through the chaos of the entity's emergence, we understand now. We see what you tried to do. Hold on just a little longer." The silvery outline turned toward them, and for a moment Astrid saw Magnus as he had been in life, proud, protective, filled with love for his people and his land. His spectral lips moved in words they could not hear, but the meaning was clear. "Do what you must, and know that you do not face this darkness alone." Ulrik stepped forward to join Astrid in the center of their protective circle, the sundering blade held ready but not yet raised to strike. For their plan to succeed, they needed to let the entity begin corrupting their bond, to allow its influence to flow through them until they became the key it needed to break free completely. "Together," Astrid said, taking Ulrik's free hand in hers. "Together," he agreed, and their fingers intertwined as the first tendrils of the entity's corruption reached toward them. The sensation was unlike anything. Either had experienced a cold that burned, a pleasure that disgusted, a promise of power coupled with the certain knowledge of what that power would cost. The entity's influence flowed into them like poison sweetened with honey, seeking to turn their love into the conduit for its escape. Around them, Runa's protective circle began to flicker as the older woman struggled to maintain the wards against forces that pressed against them like a tide of living darkness. Eric stood ready at the circle's edge, his sword drawn, and his face set with determination that could not quite hide his fear. But the entity's attention was fixed on Astrid and Ulrik, on the bond between them that it had manipulated and shaped for its own purposes. As its corruption sank deeper into their souls, they felt their individual identities beginning to blur and merge, their separate strengths combining into something that might finally be powerful enough to serve as the key to the entity's freedom. The first phase of the battle was nearly complete. The unity rune blazed to life between them as their corruption reached its peak, a symbol of power that had never existed before this moment and might never exist again. Born from the perfect fusion of guardian knowledge and warrior strength, it appeared not carved in stone or metal, but written in fire across the very air, its lines pulsing with energy that made the entity recoil in sudden uncertainty. "Impossible," the ancient evil hissed, its voice now tinged with something that might have been fear. "You cannot create new bindings. The old ways are fixed, unchanging, written in the foundations of reality itself." But Astrid and Ulrik were no longer entirely themselves. The corruption that flowed through their bond had indeed changed them, but not in the way the entity had intended. Instead of making them its servants, the darkness had become a bridge between their souls, allowing them to share not just power, but understanding on a level that transcended mortal limitations. Through Ulrik's eyes, Astrid saw the entity as it truly was, not some ancient evil beyond comprehension, but a creature driven by the same hungers and fears that motivated any living being. It was vast, yes, and old beyond measure, but it was also desperately alone, cut off from its own kind by eons of imprisonment and driven mad by isolation. Through Astrid's perception, Ulrik understood the true nature of the binding that had held the entity for so long. It was not a prison, but a wound, a place where the fabric of reality had been torn to banish something that could not be killed by conventional means. And like any wound left untreated for too long, it had begun to fester, becoming more dangerous than the original injury. "We can end this," Astrid said, but her voice carried harmonics that belonged to both of them now. "Not by destroying you, but by healing what was broken." The Unity rune pulsed brighter, its light beginning to spread outward from their joined hands. Where it touched the entity's form, the corruption began to change, shadows transmuting into something that resembled starlight more than darkness. But the entity fought against this transformation with the desperate fury of a creature that had known only hunger and rage for millennia. It lashed out with tendrils of pure malevolence, seeking to shatter their unity before the rune could complete its work. Eric's sacrifice came without warning or hesitation. As the entity's attack reached toward the Unity rune, Ulrik's brother threw himself into its path, his mortal form serving as a shield for forces beyond his understanding. The darkness struck him like lightning, and Eric collapsed with a cry that seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself. But his sacrifice bought them precious seconds, and in those moments something extraordinary happened. The protective circle that Runa had maintained around the great oak began to change, its silver light taking on the same harmonic frequency as the Unity rune. The ancient tree itself responded to this resonance, its withered branches suddenly bursting into bloom as if touched by the first breath of spring. "The land itself remembers," Runa called out, her voice strained but triumphant. "It remembers what this place was before the entity's imprisonment, when Guardian and land worked together in harmony rather than opposition. The heartstone that had shattered at the entity's emergence began to reform, but not as it had been before. Instead, it drew its substance from the Unity rune's light, becoming something new, a focus for power that belonged neither to ancient magic nor mortal strength, but to the bond between them. No. The entity roared, its form beginning to destabilize as the Unity rune's influence spread throughout Vargheim. "I will not be healed. I will not be changed. I am what I am, and I will be free." In desperation, it gathered all its remaining power and launched a final assault, not against Astrid and Ulrik directly, but against the Unity rune itself, seeking to corrupt the symbol of their bond as it had corrupted so many bindings before. But the rune was not made of ancient magic that could be twisted to serve the entity's purposes. It was born from love freely given, from sacrifice willingly made, from the understanding that some bonds grow stronger when tested by darkness rather than weakened by it. The entity's corruption struck the Unity rune and was transformed by it, darkness becoming light, hunger becoming fulfillment, rage becoming the peace that comes with acceptance of what cannot be changed. "We offer you a choice," Ulrik said, and his words carried the authority of 7 generations of warriors who had died fighting this enemy. "Continue as you have been, trapped in endless hunger and rage, or accept the healing that can free us all." For a moment that stretched like eternity, the entity hesitated. In its ancient eyes that had seen the birth of kingdoms and the fall of empires, they saw the reflection of every soul it had corrupted, every dream it had devoured, every hope it had twisted into despair. And in that reflection, perhaps it finally saw what it had become, not the free creature it had once been, but a prisoner of its own making, trapped not by external bindings, but by its refusal to accept that some hungers could only be satisfied by letting go of the need to feed. The Unity rune pulsed once more, offering transformation to an entity that had forgotten it had ever been anything other than hunger and shadow. The choice was made. The new dawn crown formed from light itself as the entity made its choice, a circlet of intertwined silver and gold that materialized above the reformed heartstone like a promise kept across generations. Where the Unity rune had blazed with transformative fire, this final artifact pulsed with the gentle warmth of morning sun breaking through. Winter clouds, a symbol not of power conquered, but of peace freely chosen. The entity's transformation was not the violent dissolution they had expected, but something infinitely more beautiful and terrible. The ancient hunger that had driven it for millennia simply released, like a breath held too long, finally exhaled, like a fist clenched in anger, slowly opening to reveal an empty palm. The creature's essence scattered into points of starlight that rose toward the heavens and disappeared into whatever realm such beings called home. In its wake came silence, not the oppressive quiet of waiting danger, but the profound peace that follows the resolution of conflicts too long endured. The corrupted shadows that had twisted through Vargheim's buildings faded like morning mist, leaving behind structures that seemed more solid and real than they had in generations. Astrid opened her eyes to find herself lying beside the great oak, Ulrik's hand still clasped in hers, but their supernatural bond returned to the gentler connection of mortal love. The bloodstone pendant at her throat had changed, its deep red darkened to burgundy shot through with veins of gold, still a focus for guardian power, but no longer carrying the burden of ancient fears. "Is it over?" Ulrik asked, his voice rough with exhaustion, but carrying an undertone of wonder as he gazed up at branches that now bore leaves of silver and gold, as if the oak itself had been transformed by what it had witnessed. "It is ended," Runa confirmed, though the older woman's voice carried a weariness that spoke of more than just physical fatigue. She knelt beside Eric's still form, her weathered hands checking for signs of life with the skill of one who had tended many injuries over the years. Eric lived, though he would carry scars from his encounter with the entity's final assault, not physical wounds, but a deeper understanding of what true courage meant, and a humility that would serve him well in the years to come. His eyes opened to show not the glassy intensity of supernatural influence, but the clear gaze of a man who had faced his own weaknesses and found strength on the other side. "Brother," he whispered when he saw Ulrik kneeling beside him, "I remember everything now, not just what the entity showed me, but what was real beneath its lies. You found exactly what you needed to find, not just a way to break our family's curse, but a way to heal something that had been broken for far longer than any of us understood." Over the following days, as word spread and the evacuated villagers began to return, the true extent of the transformation became clear. Vargheim itself had changed. Not just in the obvious ways, the golden leaves of the great oak, the heartstone's new configuration, the buildings that seemed somehow more solid and welcoming, but in subtler alterations that spoke to shifts in the very nature of the place. The well that had produced tainted water now ran clearer than mountain springs. Children who had been plagued by nightmares slept peacefully and woke with smiles. The village dogs, once fearful and aggressive, resumed their traditional roles as loyal companions and guardians. Most remarkably, the binding sword that had hung cold and lifeless at Ulrik's side now rang with warmth and purpose when drawn, its blade gleaming with an inner light that spoke of curses broken and proper heritage restored. 7 generations of corruption had been cleansed in a single night, and the weapon once again knew its true purpose as protector rather than burden. "What will you do now?" Elder Bjorn asked them on the morning of the 5th day, when it had become clear that Vargheim's transformation was permanent rather than temporary. The old man's attitude toward Astrid had undergone its own change, where once he had looked at her with suspicion and fear, now his eyes held the respect due to one who had proven herself willing to sacrifice everything for her people's welfare. "We will do what guardians have always done," Astrid replied, her hand resting on the new dawn crown, where it sat in a place of honor beside the great oak. "We will remember what others are blessed to forget, and we will ensure that the knowledge needed to prevent such threats is passed down to those who come after us." The crown itself had become a symbol of hope for the entire region. Word of what had happened in Vargheim spread to neighboring settlements, carried by traders and travelers who spoke of a village where ancient evils had been not destroyed but redeemed, where love had proven stronger than corruption and understanding more powerful than force. But perhaps the most profound change was in Astrid and Ulrik themselves. Their love, tested by supernatural corruption and forged in the crucible of ultimate sacrifice, had emerged not weakened but strengthened. They understood now that true partnership required more than shared affection. It demanded the willingness to face darkness together and the wisdom to choose healing over vengeance when such choices presented themselves. Runa remained with them, her own guardian heritage now openly acknowledged as she took on the role of training the next generation of threadkeepers, for there would be others, children born of the union between guardian knowledge and warrior strength, inheritors of a legacy no longer defined by burden and sacrifice, but by service and hope. Erik established himself as Vargheim's new leader, his experiences with the entity having taught him the difference between strength and brutality, between leadership and domination. Under his guidance, the village became known throughout the northern lands as a place where conflicts could be resolved through understanding rather than force, where ancient wisdom was valued alongside practical skill. As seasons turned and years passed, the story of what had happened in Vargheim became legend, not the dark kind of legend that warned against dangerous knowledge, but the bright kind that reminded listeners of humanity's capacity for growth and redemption. Children would gather around evening fires to hear how love had conquered an ancient evil, how courage had found a way to heal what had seemed beyond healing. And at the heart of it all stood the new dawn crown, a reminder that even the darkest night eventually gives way to morning, and that some victories are won not by defeating one's enemies, but by helping them remember what they had been before fear and hunger claimed their souls. The curse was broken, the Guardian's burden shared, and Vargheim looked forward to a future bright with possibility.